Hey guys, welcome back to Model Farm Studio. In this video, I'll be sharing the start to finish process of customizing this 1/64 scale Harvestore silo. First, I want to give a big thank you to Jay at Grain Builder. A majority of the 3D printed parts that you'll see me use in this video were designed by him, so this silo's transformation wouldn't be possible without his help. Jay's primary focus is incredibly detailed grain bins and components, hence the name Grain Builder. If it's of interest to you, you can find links to Jay's pages on Facebook and Shapeways along with my complete parts list in the description section of this video. So let's get started. Hope you guys enjoy. So before jumping into this build, I thought it might be interesting to add a little history about these silos. Since the late 1800s, silos have been an effective method of storing feed for farms with cattle. While new storage concepts like bunkers and bags have grown in popularity over the years, silos still stand tall on many North American farmsteads today. One of the most recognizable silo manufacturers was the A.O. Smith Company. A.O. Smith originally found success in glass-lined water heaters, which eventually led them to design water storage tanks that they called aqua stores in the late 1930s. About a decade later, A.O. Smith created their Harvestore products company and began selling a similar technology to farmers in the form of dark blue silos that were appropriately called Harvestores. These silos offered farmers superior storage results and eventually became the popular silage storing solution in the decades that followed. In fact, some folks believe that a Harvestore silo was a sign of a successful farm, and that the more Harvestores a farm had, the more successful it was, especially considering the cost of building one was often double or triple the cost of a stave silo at the time. Today, the Harvestore silo line is still produced by a company called Columbian Steel Tank Industries, which purchased the A.O. Smith Engineered Storage Products Company in 2001. The silo I'm working with in this video was made by Standy Toys, which is now distributed by Mini Truck and Tractor. For a beginner or as a toy, these plastic silos are pretty nice right out of the box, especially considering they're reasonably priced. However, with the addition of some small details that I'll be showing, they can also be easily transformed to look like a high-end replica. The silo I started with had 8 blue rings, 7 of which had ladder and bolt detail, while 1, the base ring, had vertical stiffeners. As you can see, the roof on mine was white, but a blue roof was also available to reflect an early version. On the side of the silo was a silver blower pipe that attached to pre-drilled holes found on each ring. The rings were part of a modular design and, in 1/64, scaled out to 20 feet wide by 10 feet high. In other words, these 8 rings combined to represent a 20 by 80 silo, but I opted to remove one ring and make mine a 20 by 70. Next, let's take a quick look at the assortment of 3D printed parts I used, starting with the ones designed by Grain Builder. I used 6 pre-painted sections of modular blower pipe, a fill spout that mounted on top of the blower pipe, a white cap for the roof, 2 sections of ladder and cage, and a top platform that featured railing and a piece of mesh for a floor grate. I want to mention that all of these items came cleaned and painted. As you might recall from some of my other videos, half the battle with 3D printed parts is getting them properly cleaned, so having this step already completed was a real time saver for me. The other 3D printed part I used was this ring that I printed from Jensen Diecast store on Shapeways. This simple ring represented the concrete footer found at the bottom of the silo. If you wanted to skip this, an alternative would be to make a pad out of a piece of foam board instead. Moving back to the silo, I started by cleaning up the rings and the roof. If you look closely, some small burrs or extra material can be found as remnants of the injection molding process. I used a variety of small needle files to carefully remove these, then turned to a fine grit sanding stick to smooth these areas up. As a side note, I chose not to sand the ladders molded on the rings and roof, as the new 3D printed components easily hid them. Once I was happy with the sanding, I dipped each of the rings in a small container of water and then scrubbed them with an old toothbrush to remove any of the filings. After the rings dried off, I glued them all together using small dots of superglue on their tapered ends. Aside from saving me time, the benefit to not sanding off the ladders was that they enable me to easily line the rings up during this step. By lining these up, the panels in the mold were aligned just like they are on the real silos. A little white haze or craze showed up after the glue set, and I figured it might be helpful to explain what I do in these situations. To clean this, I wipe the rings with some 91% alcohol on a paper towel, but you could also use Vaseline here if your project is finished or not headed to paint. If you've ever had this happen to you, this is typically caused by moisture either on the item itself or in the place where it's drying. In this case, it likely came from a combination of me soaking the parts gluing the rings tightly where the fumes couldn't easily vent, and some humidity in my basement. Next, I applied a heavy coat of white primer made by Rust-Oleum. I liked the fact that this primer was white, as it was easy for me to spot any areas that I missed when applying the blue paint that you'll be seeing me use here shortly. I also sprayed some of this primer on the roof. I decided just to leave this top in the primer to give it a dull, faded look to replicate how the real versions weather over time. After the primer dried, I sprayed on a few coats of dark blue Krylon Fusion paint that was specifically advertised for plastic. I also applied some gray primer to the footer. The powder I used was made by Arizona Rock and Mineral Company and was considered concrete paving material. The instructions were straightforward and required a 50-50 mix of water and white glue. After mixing, I applied this with a palette knife, which is typically used for oil painting. As a side note, this didn't need to be perfectly smooth, as I discovered that this mixture could actually be sanded. Once the blue paint was dry, I decided that I wanted to paint the heads that simulated holding the panels together. If you like a challenge, feel you've got a steady hand, and have the motivation to paint hundreds of dots with a toothpick, this is for you. I also applied some silver around the rings with a pin. As you can see, I used the pin in a sort of dragging fashion where its thinness was an advantage to avoid applying excessive paint. Next, I applied some silver paint to the small door or hatch on the roof. If you look closely at the roof on a real Harvestore silo, you'll notice that the ribs between the panels show signs of weathering. This typically appears as either black or brown in color. I decided to paint mine with some dark brown acrylic paint, once again using the edge of a pin. Along the way, I also added a few extra dots of paint to suggest some more grime. I applied some super glue to the underside of the cap, then carefully positioned it in the hole in the roof. A small platform with handrails runs from the ladder cage on the side of the silo to the center of the roof. The kit from Grain Builder came with a small piece of mesh fabric to replicate the metal grate floor. Using a pin, I carefully applied some super glue to this fabric and positioned it in place with some tweezers. Then I used a pair of diagonal cutters to remove the bracing in the center so that it could fit around the cap. I used a needle file to remove the tabs that were left behind. At this point, I was ready to install the roof. I used Elmer's glue around the outside edge since the cap was already designed to seat inside of the ring, and because I knew I didn't have to worry about any haze getting on the paint. In other words, this glue was simply applied as an extra safety measure to keep the roof in place. As a side note, it was important to make sure that the pre-existing ladders molded into the roof and top ring were aligned so that the 3D printed parts would hide them. I put some black acrylic paint on the center of the cap. As you'll be seeing a little later, a fill spout would eventually be installed directly over top of this. Since the cap was fixed, I chose black because I thought it could pass for being open or closed, since many of these tops look grimy like other components on the roof. The platform was ready to be installed at this point. Several small legs were designed to fit between the ribs on the roof, so I marked where these were going to be located with a pencil. Then I applied a small dot of glue on the marks and positioned the cage by gently applying a little pressure with my fingers. I stress the word gently, as 3D printed parts can be quite fragile. To attach the blower pipe, I put a little Elmer's glue inside each of the pre-drilled holes in the rings. I used Elmer's again for the same reasons I mentioned earlier with the roof, but also because the slow dry time gave me plenty of time to position each piece. I'll add that it was important that each section of pipe was angled slightly further away from the ring that it was mounted to, the further down it was positioned on the silo. If it was too far away or too close at the top, the angled fill spout would not be positioned in the center of the roof. This was probably my favorite bit of detail to install on this project, as each section of pipe not only fit seamlessly within each other, but also in each ring on the silo. A small dab of superglue was applied to the top piece of blower pipe to attach the fill spout. It was important to check the orientation of the fill spout from both the top and side to make sure that it was sitting straight. As easy as the blower pipe was to install on the side of the silo, attaching the ladder cage to it was probably the most challenging step in this build. As you can see here, without some trimming, the top of the upper cage would not have sat flush against the silo as the top railing was in the way. To work around this, I cut the top section of ladder off, as well as a small section of the front of the cage. After some further thought, I decided that installing the entire cage assembly as one single piece would be easier than gluing them on individually. This meant that the top of the ladder on the middle cage needed to be removed so that the two ladders would line up together inside. To remove the nubs, I lightly pressed the sanding wheel on my Dremel tool against the edge so that the top two braces would sit flush against each other. I chose not to remove either of the two horizontal cage braces to make sure that the area where they were glued together maintained its strength. If you recall from earlier, I had two sections of ladder cage shown in the parts section. I discovered at this point that I actually needed a third cage in order to reach the bottom of the silo. So I repeated the steps that I explained before after I cut the flared end off of what became the middle section. To better replicate the stiffeners on the bottom ring, I used this gray 3/64 angled styrene that was made by Plastruct. I cut each piece to what scaled out to be 6 feet. Once these were cut out, I glued them to the ribs that were molded into the bottom ring, being careful to make sure that each piece faced the same direction. I'll mention that I intentionally didn't make these stiffeners go around the entire ring since they would have interfered with the roof on my silo room unless I cut out notches for each of them. I've mentioned before that I try to strategize when I attach certain details to a project based on how fragile they are. The more fragile a detail is, the longer I try to postpone attaching it. In the case of the completely assembled ladder cage, it was one of the last pieces to be glued on. Part of the challenge in gluing this were the slight imperfections on each of the rings, so I had to carefully inspect where the cage was able to make contact and then use a pin with a small amount of superglue to tack it in place. Now it was time for the fun part, weathering. I used basic dark brown acrylic paint on a brush and began working on the blower pipe first. I like this brown a lot since it's a versatile shade that could resemble rust or even general grime. When I'm weathering an item, I try to think directionally. I think to myself, which way would condensation run? Where would water pull up? What areas might have welds that rust? Are there painted areas worn down to bare metal where rust might occur? In the case of the side of the silo, general grime, whether it's juice from crops or rust from metal, would have streaked downward, so I made sure to pull the paint with my brush in that direction. I painted the fill spout with the same technique, pulling paint down on the sides and pulling it down from a thicker splotch on top. The ladder cage and the platform on the roof were up next. I dabbed some lighter brown paint on the bottom ring with a brush. Since the ground around the bottom of a silo frequently experiences a lot of traffic during filling, I added this to suggest some dust and mud. Perhaps a little mud splashed up on the side during rainstorms, or maybe some wind blew some dust onto it. I carefully painted the stiffeners at the bottom of the silo silver with a small detail brush. Once the silver paint was dry, I added some light streaks of the dark brown paint to the top and bottom of each of them. I picked up A.O. Smith Harvestore decals from Boston Implement and cut them out with a pair of scissors. I separated the top portion with the American flag on it from the text, as they would be placed on separate panels. I trimmed as much excess decal paper off the flag as possible. While these sheets were clear, they can still reflect a slight glare in the right light. I marked the center of the panels to help position the decals with a pencil. Then I carefully applied them with a pair of tweezers. After I put a little super glue on top of the concrete footer, I carefully set the silo on top of it. This was as simple as positioning the silo until it appeared to be spaced evenly. For a finishing touch, I added 3 warning decals on the side that were also from Boston Implement. That wraps up this quick build. This silo will look right at home on my future dairy diorama alongside its smaller 20 by 50 counterpart that you see here. Once again, I'd like to thank Grain Builder for helping me transform this silo. 3D printed details like the ones you saw me use are quickly taking builds up another notch for the farm toy hobby. Just imagine the work involved with tediously scratch building these parts like the ladder cage out of styrene or brass. I hope this video was helpful for you, whether that means you picked up a new technique, you feel inspired to try your hand at customizing a Harvestore silo, or if nothing else, you look at those big blue silos differently. Until next time, thanks for watching.